So why is this? Please don't use that table.
Okay, I know, I was just like, I just put my tea there, don't. Perfect, just getting away from the fan, to be honest.
Oh, yeah. I wonder where the fan control is. I don't think you need it.
I don't encourage
It
that.
tells us not to turn it off.
Oh.
I don't encourage that. I don't encourage that. The investment committee's job is to do what it's doing.
Serious business.
Okay, so how did you bunch of label?
I think what we should do is just report out at the next one.
Okay. 4 pendants. Okay.
And just not
LED.
just say this is what we're gonna do, and we have it.
Okay.
Right?
So you're at UBC, am I right?
I graduated from UBC
Oh, I
actually.
see.
Yeah. Yeah, now I work at the Stanley Park Ecology Society.
Oh, wow. So did you guys move from, I was in Stanley Park for near the Rose Garden, and there's a sign there that says Stanley Park next to the horse barn.
Oh, so yeah, so we're, the office is in the dining pavilion that's near the Rose Garden, kind of right
yeah.
next to the bus loop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's like a nice big venue spaces there as well, but yeah.
It used to be on the south side of Lost Lagoon.
Okay, yes, we also have our nature house there as well. That's our visitor
Oh, okay.
center.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that it's not, you're not getting bounced from one place to another.
Yes,
And...
yeah, no, we have good options there.
Okay, so you want to set up here?
Sure, yeah, that sounds great.
And you can start Zoom with those links I gave you.
What's her if she's done?
So that's for sharing my screen, right?
No, it's not methodology. I would be I think
Is it? Oh, okay, so it'll pop up.
I mean,
From my computer.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Trudy, how nice to see you.
Hi.
It's been a while. We should get together. Okay, what do I need to do next?
This is even better. Bye.
Yeah, let's try that. Oh, I have to make you co-host. So, Julia, make co-host. You're Julia. Yeah.
But if you want more and I would say it should be a moving target. It should be something that we review, periodically, and allocate certain.
Okay.
And that's what Terry was.
So, I see. So I have to move here.
conservative reservoir, that's what's in the portfolio. The so-called
Oh.
SIP.
Did you say you brought?
So I think instead of being too worried about.
Yeah.
Or actually, this one doesn't need a dongle, it's just, I have like a backup laptop.
This is an example of what we go down into this plot. This is what we currently expect for that plot. This is an SIP for that plot. And here's an SIP for this plot. I just have the different plots and an approximate amount do you think is a reasonable plot. And I usually allocate, you know, 10. That's what I would recommend. It's just as a
And then I can share my screen.
As well, yes.
maybe that we should allocate differently. That's fine.
Okay, that's working. And we need to turn off your audio.
Oh, yeah.
Because we'll be.
Like months, you know, yes, should be off now, and audio's off. Yeah, there's more sense.
You're welcome to turn on the video. I'll be pointing the camera.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm going to change my instructions because I think this works better.
Sure.
That's not gonna happen. I don't think that's gonna happen. I think, you know,
After the camp, I have a couple of days after the camp, my brother and sister-in-law arrived.
we have it in the foundation, we have the investment phase, that's what their job is. Funds, endowment fund, stewardship fund, et cetera, right? Conservation fund, different dollars. That's its job.
This month after they were gone, I went TV shopping, I got lucky there was a Google TV on sale at
Nor do I,
London Drugs.
nor do I.
It was a great big 50-inch, only $379. So I
Do an SIP and get Terry to do an SIP for different plots and money with different. You don't necessarily but a investment policy for that fund. And then it's up to the board and the investors. Committee to allocate how they want that. Once it's allocated, the SIPs are already done. It has to be the investment. It's hard to say. Yeah, we have the SIP, prepared, that will be how we invest in this. And what it runs, make sure it makes sense.
We go to TV Guide and select the thing you want, and then you just press record.
Tea, cookies.
That's what he's doing, he's putting together investment policies for each one of those funds. That's what he's really pushing that right now, and let's do it. He's pretty good at it, let's just let him do that, we're not trying to mess with him, certainly not fix it. I know, this or that. Maybe, but this is not something that's in your domain.
Hurry, but
Yeah.
back here, everything's fine.
I was going to get my juice. I've left it over there.
My friend Amira just had her first cataract done. and had remonted, so they'll do the second one fairly soon, I hope. Yeah. She had hers done up in Courtney though,
Oh,
whereas, my ophthalmologist was down in Nanaimo.
yeah, I think I went up to Courtney.
Good job, okay.
Yeah, I did,
Mhm.
because we go to a guy up there.
All right, yeah.
Nice thing about Courtney is that the hospital doesn't charge any parking fees.
Oh, that is nice.
They never have since they put the new hospital there. They've never.
Okay.
Oh yes, turn up volume might be a good idea.
Yeah.
Where's the volume? Come on. It's there. Oh, and yes, would have flipped that up a bit. That's better. I turn it down when I'm using it just for me.
You might even pop up on here.
Sorry?
Is the photograph pop up?
Oh, please, yes.
Oh, not the ones from the camera because they're not there yet.
No, but, okay. No, they might,
Oh.
in passing, you might recognize it.
Well, I think you're, yeah.
No, it's none of those.
Okay. No, well, it just started, right? Make really nice photo objects, don't they? I think we all got photos like that.
And yeah, and because they're on the daisies, they're busy going around the daisy, and so they stay there. And I must put this back in the kitchen. There's been skippers and stuff as well.
I don't know if I told you, just interrupt me if I did, but I got a really creepy picture on the daisy once without planning it. I was up at, in fact, I was up at Cumberland and there was a daisy. There was a fly on it. So I photographed the fly and then I noticed down the other end, at the other end of the flower, there was a spider sitting there and I just photographed and I clicked with, however, I clicked a couple more photos without looking. When I got home to process my pictures, I realized the spider managed to run all the way around and grab the fly without disturbing the fly. He was able to run on that flower and catch it, and he had it in his fangs.
Yeah,
I hadn't seen it until I got the photo, and it, holy smokes, look at that.
We've watched while those crab spiders have been hiding on a flower. Then something comes along.
They can really jump too.
Yeah.
Spiders.
Yeah, they're rotten little things.
Oh. The big one, I don't want to let them bite me, but
Have a look just to see who's here.
yeah.
Whoops. Oh, come on, show me the gallery.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi, is that Denis?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just looking for the gallery to see who's here.
Oh, so yeah, and there's a people in person.
Yeah, nice to hear you, Denis, even if I can't see you on the gallery at the moment. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Oh, I've been looking forward to this for a long time because it's about pet subject.
Yes, I sent to Julia your photo of bees resting in a trillium.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure it was fun.
Yeah.
Oh, the microphone for the room, Teresa, is over there.
That was what the government has spent. They would have spent that. Yeah, so, it's
just wanted to say, we're gonna start in about 5 minutes, but free to help yourself to, there's coffee, tea, and cookies at the back there.
Right down my alley. Oh, okay, see.
Resources.
You tried it yet, dude?
Gotta look things over.
Yeah, still good. Didn't I already tell you that, or was it just
No.
starting to?
No, you have conversations in your head. Or a plan.
Yeah.
That looks delicious. Well, how's the corn? Still fresh?
Yeah.
Good.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's pretty bizarre.
Yeah, we have someone else based in Kelowna as well, so I'm there.
I'm gonna come to your.
Yeah, it's getting there, you know, so let's see, I have a book actually I can bring out.
Good corn.
This is the only field guide for bees that I have. It's just for bumblebees, but it's for northern.
Grandmother's old recipe.
Nice one. Yeah.
Corn?
It starts out with
Yeah.
general information about, their life cycles.
That's how you need it. It's good.
And then it goes into sections. Maybe that's especially useful if you're in a local region. It's tricky if you're trying to compare, across the continent if you don't have the specimens in front of you. But yeah, yeah, you can even, it tells you their emergence based on when the queens come out, when the males come out, when the females come out.
Okay.
More grab water. Water.
Suddenly I've lost the sound.
Let's go. Do you know where they are? Are they at the Unitarian Church or the one in Carousel?
I think they're in Carousel.
There you go. This is your knot.
Well, no, they might
Just all the
be,
dishes splattering.
yeah, they might be on 41st, 49th. Yeah, because these aren't birds, these are bees.
Yeah. Well, the birds are at the church. Oh, 49, that's the Unitarian Church.
Yeah.
How's it like?
Webpage. Okay. Yeah, here you go. And then
The
I can.
sound isn't seeming to be so good. But I'm gonna get sharper knives. I can't cut sausages with that.
Let me see your phone now so I can figure out what it is.
No, there it comes.
No.
Fall season. My name is Teresa Gagne and I'm a member of the Botany Section Committee. I'd like to start off by stating that we are grateful and honored to be living on and sharing the natural beauty of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We appreciate that their past centuries of stewardship have preserved these beautiful areas for our enjoyment today, and acknowledge the need to work with them to safeguard these lands and all their inhabitants for future generations to appreciate. Whether you are here in Vancouver or joining us from the territories of another First Nations people, we urge you to join us in a moment of reflection and commitment. So first, here are some of the upcoming events in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So for outings, on Saturday, September 21st, birding at Queen Elizabeth Park, Kevin Yip and Neil Van Hinsberg will co-lead a walk around the park, checking duck ponds, wooded areas, and gardens. The walk will start at 8 a.m. and last approximately 2 hours. This is an easy walk on mostly level ground with a few small hills. Trails are either paved or hard packed. And this event is catered to beginning birders. If you have mobility issues, please let us know and we can cater the walk to your needs. There will be some binoculars to lend if you don't have a pair. A week later, on Saturday, September 28th, birding at Iona Beach Regional Park. This one runs from 8:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Again, Neil Van Hinsberg and Jan Lowcock joined them for a fall morning birding trip along Iona Beach Regional Park in Richmond. The tide will be well out, but we can scan the beach, mudflats, and explore the outer ponds and river areas, plus the wooded trails on the lookout for shorebirds, resident birds, and those migrating south for the winter. On Tuesday, October 1st, there's an even less energetic birding outing. This is a welcome hawk watch sit at Cypress Mountain. Sounds really interesting. 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Join us for a fun, relaxed afternoon of stationary hawk watching on Cypress Mountain. Target birds are migrating red-tailed, sharp-shinned, Cooper's, broad-winged, and Swainson's hawks, bald eagle, turkey vulture, peregrine falcon, osprey, and merlin. Please bring a foldable chair if you wish, and any art supplies and or snacks. Pre-registration is required, and 6 pairs of loaner binoculars are available on a first-come, first-served basis. Upcoming evening presentations from Nature Vancouver. On the first Thursday in October, October the 3rd, Cowichan Bring Back the Bluebirds project from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Nature Vancouver is pleased to welcome Jackie Taylor, who will be our Birders Night speaker. Jackie will be speaking about the Cowichan Bring Back the Bluebirds project, an initiative of British Columbia Conservation Foundation and the Cowichan Valley Naturalists. This will be a Zoom-only presentation. On the Monday preceding the event, Nature Vancouver members will receive the Zoom link in the weekly e-news. Non-members are welcome and should email e-news at Nature Vancouver for a few days ahead of time to register for the link, or join the Nature Vancouver meetup group and RSVP yes to the event, and you'll be sent the link. On Thursday, October 17th, Alan LaRocque of UBC Forestry will be speaking at our next botany night on fish, forests, and fungi. Again, that's from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The talk starts at 7:30, but there's refreshments and socializing before time. Like tonight, this one will be a hybrid in-person and Zoom presentation, and you're encouraged to bring mushroom samples and we'll help you try to ID them. So those are the upcoming events. I don't have a special topic nights. Is there a special topic nights in September, Carolyn, that I missed?
You know, I think we've had trouble securing it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss it from
No, we haven't
missed it from the calendar.
I remember, we may come up with one still, but.
So check your e-news and the website in case there is a presentation for the special topics for September. But otherwise, the next one will be Thursday, October 3rd. Okay, now I want to welcome both members and non-members to tonight's presentation on brilliant native bees of British Columbia. If you enjoy it, please consider joining or renewing your Nature Vancouver membership. It's very affordable and can be done via the website or by emailing membership@naturevancouver.ca. So our talk tonight is on the brilliant native bees of British Columbia. BC is home to around 600 different native bee species and has the greatest diversity of native bees in all of Canada. This includes 30 species of bumblebee, as well as mason bees, miner bees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, and the beautiful sweat bees, whose metallic sheen seems at odds with their humble name. These bees don't make honey, but they are essential for pollinating most of our native wildflowers, and like honeybees, they also pollinate crops that provide us with food. Our speaker tonight, Julia Taylor, is a board member of the Native Bee Society of British Columbia, a collective of native bee researchers, artists, land managers, conservation practitioners, and enthusiasts working together to promote the conservation of native bees in British Columbia. A lifelong resident of the Pacific Northwest, Julia is a lover of all organisms who call this region home, especially our native pollinators. She has worked, studied, and volunteered in the conservation realm for nearly a decade, and recently completed her Bachelor of Science from UBC, specializing in ecology, biodiversity, and sustainable food systems. There, she conducted bumblebee biodiversity surveys at UBC Farm and on blueberry fields around the Fraser Valley, falling further in love with the diversity of native bees and their habits. Julia also has experience in science communication and social media outreach through her time coordinating online content and condensing academic articles with UBC's Center for Sustainable Food Systems, BC Food Web, and has a great passion for sharing environmental knowledge with the audience of all backgrounds and in fostering public engagement in ecological issues. So we're really delighted to have Julia with us tonight to present on the brilliant native bees of British Columbia.
Thank you all so much. So happy to be here this evening. Have my water here. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Hope everybody's having a great night tonight. So yes, my name is Julia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to be here today on behalf of the Native Bee Society of BC. So here to talk about all things native bees, as we heard. So a little bit more about me. As we heard, I graduated from UBC, and so that's definitely where I kind of had my initial falling in love with my gateway bees, as I call them, my bumblebees, which is, really easy to fall in love. They're so charismatic, and so I worked at the UBC farm doing those surveys. We surveyed lots of different things, but the bumblebees were, I would say, my favorite. So we can see an example of our gear there. We catch them in nets, put them in little vials, and then cool them down actually in a cooler. So it's a non-lethal method of sampling, and then we can get really up close, identify them ideally to species if possible, and then we can release them. They'll warm back up and be on their merry way and keep pollinating. So I enjoyed that component, as lethal sampling in the entomology world is very important for a lot of things, but for other things you can do it in a different way. So happy to kind of speak on both of those parts there. And then in the corner is my former supervisor, Jennifer. She's actually also part of the Native Bee Society, and we were doing surveys on blueberry farms last summer. So all sorts of surveys and love for bees here. And again, part of the Native Bee Society of BC. So we started in 2019. We're here 5 years strong now, and so we're celebrating all sorts of accomplishments, and we had lots of different events for Pollinator Week, for instance, this past summertime. And so happy to represent kind of part of our education and outreach programs here. And so this kind of fits right in. But what's the big deal? Why should we care about our native bees? So we heard a bit in that introduction about some of the glory and beautiful nature of our native bees here. We have the most diversity in British Columbia of all of the Canadian provinces. So about in the range of 450 to 600 species. There's a couple different numbers floating around here. So, science is always updating and changing those things. And so really exciting here in the Georgia Depression, our eco-region here in the lower mainland, it's about 150 species. And so that's kind of this corner down here, this gray bit. And so just lots of opportunities to really fall in love and also to spread the news, since a lot of folks probably, when they think about bees, they probably think about the European honeybee, which, as the name suggests, is not native to our continent at all. European honeybee was brought over for agriculture many hundreds of years ago, actually. So happy to dare I say, spread the buzz about our native bees here. And of course, bees are pollinators. We can celebrate some of our other native pollinators in BC, of course. We have our bees, but we also have their relatives, the wasps. Shout out to the wasps. They get a bad rap, but they are so great and so important, and they have a bad reputation, but they're really cool. We also have our flies, of course, and then butterflies, moths, beetles, birds, and then not in North America, but just in Central America and South America, we have bats that do some pollination as well, not to exclude the flying mammals there. But let's, go in a little bit deeper, back up as well as dive right in, talking about what is a bee. So there's a little taxonomy breakdown on the left of the screen there in terms of, the order of things: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Gets a little messy with subfamilies and superorders and all those things, but those are the basics. And so bees, they are a part of the animal kingdom in the phylum Arthropoda, so got those external or exoskeleton invertebrates, and so happy representatives there. And then they're in the order Hymenoptera, and so that is home to our bees, but also, like I said before, their relatives, the wasps, and also ants, sawflies, hornets as well, and so lots of important insects in that order. And then they have their own superfamily, Apioidea, and so it's, includes stichoid wasps, which are actually, there's an example in the corner there in amber, which is likely their ancestors. So bees, they co-evolved with flowering plants in the early Cretaceous period, so between 145-66 million years ago. So during that time, before that, flowering plants were just kind of getting going, and there was a large explosion during that time of flowering plant diversity. So before that, we had our gymnosperms, so our conifers and our seed-producing plants, but then after that, we had our flowering plants, and so it's likely that bees evolved from these wasps that are predatory wasps, but they're likely basically just a vegetarian version of that wasp. And so you can see, like I said, this insect, or this example in amber here from Myanmar, and probably one of the closest relatives of bees from about 100 million years ago. So very exciting, and we would not have the diversity of bees without the diversity of flowering plants and vice versa, so they're all very, very interconnected here. And being insects, they have the basic insect anatomy, so they've got the three components, the main components being their head, and then the thorax is their middle bit, and then their abdomen on the end. And so the head is where we got the sensing. We have, of course, our mouth parts as well in terms of feeding, but also maybe defending, and also maybe cutting, leafcutter bees, for example. We'll get into that, of course. And also sensory organs. So bees have 2 eyes, as most things do, but they also have some bonus eyes, pretty much, called ocelli, which are simple eyes, located, there are 3 of them, right on the top of their head between their formal eyes, and these ocelli are mostly for sensing light, and so they kind of can help them orient them towards the sun so that they know where they're flying and can kind of help them navigate that way, but they're not seeing a ton of detail with those eyes, but kind of fun. They basically have 5 eyes, which is kind of fun to think about. And then the thorax, that middle bit, they've got their locomotion. So they have their wings, they have 2 pairs of wings, so that's 4 wings total. And then they also have 6 legs, like all good insects do. And then in the abdomen is where we get the digestion, of course, and then also reproductive parts. And then at the end, if they are females, they will have a stinger. But that's one little fun fact, is that only female bees sting, because it comes from their ovipositor, which is their little tube that places their eggs when they're laying eggs, and so it's evolved from that structure, and so only female bees can sting you. So if you get good enough to identify, especially bumblebees, you can kind of start to tell which one's a male and which one's a female, and have a little bit less fear in that sense. We'll talk a bit more about stinging later on as well. But in addition to that, we also have our pollen-carrying structures, which are very, very important, our bees being pollinators, of course, and so they got to carry it somehow. Most bees have hairs on their different parts of their body, maybe on their legs, maybe all throughout their legs, maybe on their tummies, and that's how they will collect their pollen there. And so there is a corbicula, or a pollen basket, for some bees, like our honeybees and also our bumblebees, but also scopa is another kind. And so the corbicula is more of like a basket, kind of has like a concave little indentation alongside some branched hairs to collect the pollen that way. Scopa is just more just branched hairs all the way down. And they also have a crop. Some bees have a crop in their stomach, like birds do, but instead of, regurgitating their food as birds do for their young, bees will keep their pollen or whatever they're collecting in their stomach, and then they can regurgitate it that way too once they get back to their nest for provisioning. But how do we tell between bees, flies, and wasps, for instance? Because from a glance, all these photos on the left-hand side here look pretty bee-like to me, but there's some variances here. One thing I would say is to look at the head. That's a very good one. So bees and wasps have more of a triangular shaped head, kind of tear shaped sometimes. They also have longer antennae. Bees usually have a branch or like a bend in their antennae, kind of like a little elbow. Wasps less so, but they still have those longer antennae. You can compare this to flies, which have rounder heads and teeny little stubby antennae. So that's a good giveaway here. And of course, like I mentioned, bees have 4 wings total. Flies do not. They have only 2 wings. So that's 1 pair. And we can actually tell in flies they're in the order Diptera, which means di, meaning 2, and ptera with a P, meaning wing. So little taxonomy breakdown there too. But they also have evolved a lot of them to mimic bees as well. They are very good at doing that. And so we can have an example here of what you might think. I'll just give you a second to think to yourself, spot the bees in these collection of images here. Which ones you think that's a bee, maybe others not so much. Give you a couple seconds and then we'll see. Another way to, before we move on, another way to kind of tell is their behavior. So if the insect in question is visiting flowers and you can see it's collecting pollen, that's going to be a bee for you. If it's buzzing around your lunch meat in a picnic and bugging you, that's probably going to be a wasp. Wasps are carnivores, so they will, for their young, and so they want that meat. That's what they're looking for there. Bees aren't really interested in that. They have pollen as their protein source. But we'll reveal here. So we have on those top images there, the one on the left was a mining bee, and then the one on the right is a hoverfly. And same with this one down here is a fly. You can see those more stubby antennae. This one's probably one of the better mimics out there. These are usually called robber flies. There are different kinds, but a lot of them are wonderful bumblebee mimics. And so this is a strategy lots of animals will use. If they can look like something that's dangerous, but they're not dangerous, then there's a pretty good chance that a predator is still not going to mess with them. So flies, they don't have stingers. They can't do really anything other than just sponge up with their little mouth parts. But if a predator sees a fly that looks like it's got black and yellow coloring, looks like it might have a stinger, then it'll generally hold off. So that's a good strategy there. And then we have a variety of wasp-like looking insects on the right. Some of them are wasps. The 2 on the left are wasps, and the 2 on the right are bees. So you might be noticing this one really does not look like a bee, and we'll talk about that one.
So it's hard to see the 4 wings.
Yes, it is. So in some of these photos, for instance, this artistic representation is not the best, but yeah, some angles are easier to see the 4 wings than others. So looking at the antennae and the eyes is a good strategy. One other thing I didn't say about the eyes is that for flies, they have huge eyes that basically touch in the top and the middle of their head, whereas bees have eyes that are completely separate on the sides of their head, and so that's a good way to look as well. Diving back into our diversity of bees here, we have representatives from 6 of the 7 families of bees in the world. And so the 6th one, we only have 1 member of that family down here, but we still got it, so 6 out of 7. And they include a wide range of habits in terms of whether they're generalist or specialists, and we'll talk about that later on too. What their sociality is, so if they are solitary bees versus social bees living in a communal nest. And I'll just say that about 70%, about 90% of our native bees are solitary. So there's that misconception that bees are in a big hive, there's a queen, there are workers and males, but that is pretty much only true for honeybees and mostly true for bumblebees. And basically all other bees, they're solitary, they just have 1 female provisioning her nest, and we'll talk about that, their life cycles a bit more later on as well, but breaking down the misconceptions here, especially in the comparing to honeybees. So lots to break down. And then just on the left here, we have an image that shows the face of a carpenter bee. We do not have these large carpenter bees on the west coast here, but more on the eastern side of the continent. You'll get those large carpenter bees that look like bumblebees, but not quite. But we do have this little bee on the side here, which is the fairy bee, genus Perdita, and it is the smallest bee in the world, just about 2 millimeters. So hard to comprehend, but quite the range here. So diving into some of these families, we have representatives from Apidae. This includes our honeybee here, our European honeybee, but also our bumblebees and a few other members as well. And so this is the family that has that corbicula, which is that pollen basket on most of these bees, versus just the scopa, which is just kind of pollen all the way down the legs. So there's a highlighted example of what the corbicula looks like, just a nice bundle of pollen stuck to the corbicula there. It includes social and solitary bees. So like I said, our social bees, our honeybees, our bumblebees, generalists and specialists. So we'll again talk about those concepts too. Many are kleptoparasites, which I also have a slide on, but this is actually the family with the most representatives of kleptoparasites, which are basically nest stealers. So instead of provisioning for their own nest, the bee will steal the work of another, lay her eggs, and then wipe her hands clean, let the other bee kind of do the work. There are cuckoo birds as well, you might have heard of those, that lay eggs in other birds' nests, and then when those eggs hatch, they push the birds of the original species out. So similar concept here. So we have about 25% of the species in Apidae are kleptoparasites, so the largest proportion in any of the families here. We also have Megachelidae or Megachilidae, however you want to say it with those Latin terms here, include our leafcutter bees, our mason bees, our carter bees. So they generally have large imposing mouth parts, whether they want to cut their plant material or maybe they're digging into some wood there to build their nest. And so they have those large mandibles, we see that photo there. And all of these are going to be solitary bees as well. We have lots of wonderful representatives in our region for leafcutter bees. We also have our blue orchard mason bee, which is right here, Osmia lignaria. This is a great native species, especially if you're keen to kind of take a hands-on approach to bees, but you want to maybe support native species rather than getting into honeybee keeping. Raising orchard bees is a great way to do that, especially with our native blue orchard bee, which is kind of blue sheen, so that's also fun, that's a bonus. And so the Megachelidae, they have a variety of where they like to nest, whether it's in the ground or if it's in little cavities, little nooks and crannies, or little hollowed stems of plants. So lots of options. And they use lots of different substrates for lining the nests that they create, whether that is pieces of leaf that they have cut, as the name suggests for some of them, or it might be pieces of flower petal, it might be wood, it might be kind of the woolly material off of some plants. So lots of different ways that they will create their nest and things that they're cutting there. We have 3 other families represented here. So we have Andrenidae, which is our mining bees, lots and lots of diversity there. And then we have our polyester bees. They are so named because they line their nests with a waterproof material that is kind of like polyester. And so they regurgitate, they collect things from plants, and then they do some stomach chemistry, and then they line their nests that way, especially if they're in the ground, which almost all of these bees are. Especially in the Pacific Northwest where we are, you know, if you have your nest in the ground, it rains, you don't want that water seeping down in there. So polyester bees have a good strategy to overcome that. Lots of different also ranges in sociality but most of them are going to be, you know, solitary, with some being facultatively eusocial, which we'll also talk about later on too. Lots of little glimpses here. We had that little bit in the introduction about glorious sweat bees and how beautiful they are. Here's an example of one down here. That is in the Halictidae family. And so sweat bees have a lot of beautiful coloration. The metallic green sweat bees are always a fan favorite, including I'm a fan of them as well. And then we also have ground nesting, except for Hylaeus over here, and they like to nest more in cavities as well. And so lots of different diversity, of course. And then the one representative from Melitidae, however you want to say it, is Macropus nuda, which is the only species in this family we have in BC, and it is a highly specialized bee. So this means that it exclusively visits, or I should say, collects pollen from this one plant called Lysomachia ciliata, which is fringed yellow loosestrife. So that's what it's visiting right now. And so it will visit other flowers for nectar resources, such as some blackberry and salmonberry species and some blueberry species in the rubus and vaccinium genera. But they collect floral oils as well from the petals of these flowers and scrape them off with her little forelegs there and store them in her scopae. So scopa are not just for collecting pollen, but they can store other floral resources that the plants have to offer. What are floral resources? So why do bees even visit flowers? Well, why they visit flowers, partly in their co-evolutionary history together. Flowers have evolved in many ways to attract bees, to help them reproduce. So different floral shapes, sizes, colors, scents. So the reason why flowers have those flashy petals is to attract their pollinators, but they also have floral rewards for their pollinators once they do visit in the form of nectar, pollen, and floral oils generally. Nectar, we're probably familiar with nectar, very, very sugary, wonderful substance for our bees and for many, many visitors to plants. They have lots of different kind of benefits and lots of different breakdowns depending on the species of plant will produce different components in their nectar depending on who their pollinator is. Sometimes they might even have caffeine in there as another little way to kind of give the bee a way to remember that plant. Give it a little kick and say, "Ooh, that was a fun one." I don't know if that's what they say, but I imagine if I was a bee, that would give me a little caffeine kick. And so that's a really important resource, of course. And so the adults will rely on nectar throughout their whole life cycle or throughout their time being adults. And so will wasps. They like to drink nectar as well. Pollen is one thing that they like to collect, and this is for their young. So that is why bees collect pollen. It is mostly not for the adults to eat themselves. It's mostly for their young. It's a really high protein, a really great protein source, and also different levels of protein depending on the plant. And so some of them might have, they might need to diversify to get different kinds of protein in there. But they're also, the pollen grains themselves are lots of different shapes and sizes. It's really cool. You can see a lot of really great macro photography of pollen grains online these days. It's really fun. But they are often very sticky, so they like to stick, to the bees that visit. And they're highly digestible by bees, which is not always the case. Not many other organisms can easily digest pollen. They got to have special enzymes for that. And so that's useful for them. But also, they have their electrostatic charges that also help them collect pollen too. So the bees will be more negatively charged when they're approaching a flower, and the pollen positively charged helps them stick as well. So I'm afraid I don't know more of the physics than that, but pretty cool. And also floral oils. So we had that one Macropis nuda oil collecting bee that we saw. They like to collect oils as well, the volatile organic compounds that many plants will have, also sometimes known as essential oils to us. And so they'll also use this to feed their larvae. Maybe they'll use this in conjunction with pollen, make a little bundle for their young. But they'll also maybe use these oils to line their nest. So like I mentioned, the polyester bees, they'll use some oils and they'll kind of transform it and line their nest that way, or some will just take it straight as, use the floral oils in that sense as well. Now, usually they are collecting pollen, and usually they're being pollinators, but sometimes they also just like to get the floral rewards without actually doing any of the work. This is called nectar robbing, and so this is where bees or other insects, ants do this sometimes too, a little bit differently, but they will chew little holes at the base of the flower near where the nectaries are located, and then just access the nectar that way instead of going in and entering the flower. And the reason why they do that is usually because it might be a flower that is not conducive to that particular bee. So some bees have long tongues, some bees have short tongues. And so there are different flowers that have different lengths, so they can have access or not be able to access that nectar. If they got too short of a tongue, but they want to get that nectar, they'll chew a little hole and they bypass the pistil and the stamen, which are the reproductive components of the flower, and instead they just get their sweet treat and they're out. And so, they do have that example. And here's just a bigger photo so you can really see there's a hole here, there's a hole in this flower, there's a hole in this flower, there's a hole in this flower. And anecdotally for myself, I've seen this behavior happen a lot with European honeybees as well, but also our native bees. And so they might also take advantage of the nectar robbing holes left by another insect and then say, oh, that's a good idea, let me just pop in here. So it can kind of catch on in a not so great sense for the plant. But
what is the name of the flower?
yes, good question. This is bird vetch, Vicia cracca. So in the pea family, in the legume family. Good question. But when they're not nectar robbing, they are pollinating, so that is great. We should thank a pollinator. There is this kind of stat that about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that you take, you gotta thank a pollinator. That's because about 75% of flowering plants do require an animal to pollinate. Some of them get pollinated by wind or other ways. And then there are also, things like, other plants that we don't necessarily rely on pollination, like lettuce. We need pollination to plant more lettuce, but we're not eating the actual pollinated component. But fruits and veggies definitely rely on pollination. And so why are they so good at this? Well, like I mentioned earlier, coevolution. So they've been working away for millions of years together, and flowers have evolved many different shapes and sizes, as I said earlier too, to attract their different pollinators and maybe exclude others as well. And so they have different visual cues like those flashy petals and sepals as well, which is another kind of petal-like structure. They also have nectar guides sometimes. So you might have heard of this in that bees can see in kind of green and blue, but also ultraviolet. And so sometimes if you shine an ultraviolet light on some flowers, you might see little landing strips almost as a little guide saying, come on in, the nectar is right down this way, just keep coming, bee, and have at it. And so flowers have evolved that kind of guide in that way, which is not always obvious to us humans with our visual spectrum of being able to see. You can't see that ultraviolet. And so really great to kind of know that they have such a tight relationship, and just a pretty cool example of just how much they can really get in there. But compared to other insects or other, animals that might visit plants and flowers, bees in particular are really important pollinators because they are pretty much exclusively the ones who are actively collecting pollen, whereas other insects or animals, when they visit plants, they might just be drinking that nectar, like I said, but they're not collecting pollen because bees use it to feed their young, but other animals or insects, not so much. Beetles, they eat the pollen and they eat the reproductive structures of the plant, and so they might incidentally transport pollen, and other pollinators incidentally transport pollen, and so they are still pollinators, but just not in that purposeful way where bees are actually trying to collect the pollen for themselves. And so most bees, we have a question, yeah.
So what is the evolutionary advantages for not pollinating, like the nectar robbing?
For the bees, for the insects.
What are the advantages for the bees?
Yeah, so they can, nectar robbing, and an advantage is that they can access nectar that they otherwise wouldn't be able to because maybe the flower has too long of a tube, so they can't fit inside to actually get at the nectar. And so it kind of just allows them to get a treat that way because they drink nectar as adults, and so get an energy boost, but not having to go through. It's also a little bit faster too. They don't have to go and enter the flower and then exit the flower. They can just hop on the surface of it, either bite through or take advantage of a hole that another insect has bitten already, and then just in and out, take a little drink and fly on. So
it's kind of like cheating the system a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nectar robbing. They're robbing them blind in that way.
But then they're also not getting pollen to feed their young. So.
Correct, yes. So this might be more common in males, which don't provision for the nest, and so they are just drinking nectar for themselves, or maybe, another insect that, doesn't really need to collect the pollen, but.
Do flowers keep producing nectar? So if the bee comes along and picks it up, does it the next day have more nectar? Does it keep producing more nectar?
Yes,
pollen,
yeah.
I guess the same for pollen.
Yeah, so especially with nectar, that I think it's a bit faster for them to reproduce that. They have nectaries, special plant tissue where they create the nectar. I don't know, I think it depends on the plant for how fast they replenish, but they do typically replenish. Maybe if it's a really short-lived plant and they have just a few days of blooming, maybe not, but for a lot of other plants that are flowering for, a couple weeks at a time or something, they'll generally be able to replenish. So it's not like they're draining it, but especially if they bite that hole, then others might be more enticed to just use the hole that way rather than pollinating. So there's kind of a domino effect sometimes. So most bees collect pollen, but there's of course always exceptions, and so we're back to our kleptoparasites, our pollen thieves, our cuckoo bees, our brood parasites, all words for this kind of behavior. And this is where they steal the work of other bees and then just lay their eggs. And so kleptoparasites often have very tight relationships with certain hosts. Maybe it's a certain host species of bee, or maybe a certain genus that they target. But for instance, we have some examples of the different genera that these individual bees target, as well as a family that this one targets down here. So what they do is that they, like I mentioned, this female will, instead of provisioning for her own nest, she'll maybe hover around the entrance of another bee of that different species and wait for her to leave, and then get in there, and where that initial bee, the host, where she was provisioning pollen and nectar for her to lay her eggs, that cuckoo bee will slide in there, lay a couple eggs, and then wait for the bee to come back, seal up that nest cell, move on to the next one, and then do that for a few more times, depending on the bee, but trying to get as many eggs in there as possible. I said earlier that those eggs of the cuckoo bee will tend to hatch earlier, and then that cuckoo bee, the larvae, will eat either the eggs or the larvae of the host bee, get nice and big and strong, pupate into an adult, and then be on their merry way, and then go find another host to then do the very same thing back. So they don't need to collect pollen because they just rely on other bees doing that for them. So they don't really have to have pollen collecting structures. So often these bees might not be very hairy. They might look very wasp-like. So that picture earlier when we were looking at bees, flies, and wasps, one of those was a nomad bee, kind of in the wasp collection. It looked very wasp-like. That is a cuckoo bee. Looks very wasp-like because it doesn't need to collect pollen, and so it doesn't have very many hairs. And so we can see some examples down here. This one's very fun. This is a member of the Coleoxys genus, which is the sharp-tailed bees. And you can see these little kind of sharp bits at the end. They actually will use that to lay their eggs, either sometimes on the eggs or larvae of the host, or just use that to get in there. And so these bees will typically have these kinds of structures to help defend themselves, because if the host bee comes back and who is this stranger trying to lay eggs in her nest, they might need to defend themselves depending on the matchup there. So lots of different adaptations and lots of exceptions to the pollination rules. And then some of them are also just very picky in terms of which pollen they do collect. So I talked a little bit, I mentioned these words, generalists and specialists. We have that Macropis nuda, which is that oil collecting bee that's a highly specialized. So that's an example that we have in BC. There are lots of other bees that are very specialized. Some of them might be, so down here, oligolectic is another word for that, meaning very few that they eat or collect. And so they might be very specific and only target one particular species of plant, just this one species. Or maybe it'll be one genus. Or maybe it'll be a family. So maybe they'll be just in the rose family, visiting the prunes, the apricots, the cherries, all of those plants. But then there's also on the other end, generalists. They don't really care. Lots of bumblebees are generalists. They'll visit lots of different flowers and collect from many different plants, especially bees that are around for longer, and they need to have resources throughout their whole time flying around. Whereas if they're specialists, those plants might have a very short bloom time. So maybe those bees, if they're specialists, they might have a short lifespan as an adult as well, to kind of align with that blooming time there. And so it says down here, about half of all bee species in Western Canada are some kind of specialist. And so these are just some examples. I have these on some cards as well if you want to kind of take a look, but they're also available to download these resources to see the specialist bees in our region and the plants that they target if you want to try to attract them to your yard or your green space. So that's available for download on our website, bcnativebees.org. So no worries about trying to read this tiny little print here, just to kind of show that it's there as a resource. So lots of different cool options to kind of see if you want to attract some fun special bees. But we learned there are lots of different kinds of habits with bees. Some are certain kinds of sociality versus solitary. So many are solitary bees. And this means that there is a female provisioning for her nest after she's mated with a male, and that's it. There's no queens, there's no multiple generations in that span, and so that is the vast majority of our bees. And then within the solitary bees, they might have different nest types. We'll talk a bit more about these nest types as well, but there's also the primitively eusocial bees, which are our bumblebees, and I'll talk about that in the next slide with their life cycle, and then our truly social bees, and that's just the honeybees, and that they have that queen that can live for multiple years, and she does not do anything except for laying eggs, and there are highly specialized roles that each of those bees fill, but there is a little bit different, kind of way that bumblebees do things. So the bumblebee life cycle, they're primitively eusocial. So what happens is in the springtime, there is a new queen bumblebee who has freshly emerged from overwintering, and it's time for her to look for a nest location. So she'll come out, she'll hover around, maybe she'll do some zigzagging, flying low to the ground if you've ever seen that behavior before. She's looking for a suitable nest site. Maybe it'll be a little crevice in a log, maybe it'll be an abandoned rodent den. That is a prime favorite of a lot of bumblebees. They love those old rodent dens. The work's already done for them. They can just kind of pop in there and lay their eggs. And so she'll look for this nest location. This is also when, if you, early in the springtime, if you see some bees flying around, some bumblebees, and you think, that's the biggest bumblebee I've ever seen in my life, it's probably going to be a queen bumblebee. They're very big, so that's probably when you're seeing a lot of them at that time of the year. Once she finds a suitable nest location, this is where she has more of a initial solitary-like lifestyle. So this is part of what makes it not truly a social kind of bee, because this is a phase where it's the new queen, but she's still doing the work of any other female solitary bee, where she is laying eggs, she's coming back and forth between the nest and floral resources to collect pollen and nectar for her young, and then she's rearing those young in that first brood, that first kind of batch. And so after that, those will hatch, and there'll be some females that are not going to reproduce. And so this is kind of where that sociality comes in, because after the first brood is fully raised and able to go and do the collecting for her, that's when the queen will then stay in her nest for the rest of the summer and just take on that egg-laying role. And so that's when she becomes that true queen in that social component. So those worker bees, the females, they will go out and do the collecting, they'll tend to the eggs, they'll do some temperature control in the nest, all those tasks. And then later on in the late summer and fall, she'll start to switch to laying females, to laying new queens, and also males. And so this is where we kind of get this transition again, where these later generations, they actually won't stick around very much in the nest. So the males actually, they pretty much don't come back to the nest. They don't do any work for the nest. They just kind of leave, and then they drink nectar. They might sleep in flowers. If you ever see sleeping bees in flowers, those are probably males, bumblebees. And they will just wait for those new queens later in the summer to emerge and then mate. So that's their role. And so those new queens, she will fatten up, and this is where it kind of, some lines blur, because I had said earlier that mostly pollen is for feeding their young. This is an example where it's not the case, where pollen is also eaten by the new queens because she wants to fatten up for the winter before she finds an overwintering spot. So that's what happens at the end of the summer. The rest of the bees in that nest will start to die off, except for those new queens. And so they will then go on their way and start also foraging for themselves, getting some nectar too, and then again finding that spot to overwinter, and then start the whole cycle all over again once the springtime comes. So that's the life cycle of our bumblebees here.
So how many bees would be in the nest at any one time?
Good question. So it kind of depends on the species as well. So it can be several dozen to maybe 200. So that's kind of the range of the size of bumblebee nests. Again, depending on the species. Contrast that to honeybees, which can be tens of thousands of individuals in a single hive. And so, yeah, not as big, but still, enough where it can be a social functioning nest. And then we can look at the solitary bees. And so this is very different, but also the vast majority of our bees. And this is where a single female will emerge in maybe usually also the early spring as well from her overwintering location. She will then also find a nest spot. She will start to lay eggs and start to collect pollen and nectar for those eggs. Here's an example. This is kind of akin to a mason bee lifestyle. We can kind of use an example here in that mason bees like to nest in little stem cavities. So this is kind of what this is portraying. And they will actually build these nest cells, these individual little compartments with one egg per cell with one bundle of provisioning. Which is that bundle of pollen and nectar all squished together, or maybe oils as well. And so laying those eggs, creating those nest cells, and then, once she's done and she's filled up her nest and she's kind of reaching the end, then she'll not live for much longer. And then those young will hatch into larvae. They'll start to eat that provision. They'll pupate into adults. And they'll either overwinter as pupa, maybe they might overwinter as eggs, depending on the bee, or they might also overwinter as adults, but in cocoons. That is what our blue orchard mason bee does. So they will be fully pretty much pupated into their adult form, but they'll still hibernate in their cocoons before they emerge in the springtime. And so then once it gets warm enough, they'll chew their way out of their little kind of silken cocoon and fly off and start the cycle again. So very much simpler, I guess, than our social bees, and again, the vast majority of what we have here. And then I'll also say that, we have this note here that nests have a serial structure. So this is especially true for this kind of example with the mason bee, where in the tube, the back part of the tube furthest away from the nest entrance, that is usually where the female eggs will be laid, and then the closer nest cells to the entrance of the nest will be males, because they will emerge first, leave the nest, hang around, and then wait for the females to emerge so that they can mate. So that's why they have that kind of separation there, and they can control that, which is pretty cool.
They mate with other bees from the eggs from the same female.
Maybe probably different females, but maybe the same one. But they'll they might hang around that same nest entrance and wait for those females to emerge, or they might find another one. And I think they can kind of either sniff that out in different ways to sense. But it might be the same nest. It might be different ones. Yeah.
So they might nest. I mean, they might mate and lay their eggs like right away if they overwintered as pupae or eggs, or if they're like the bumblebee, they would mate. And then they wouldn't lay their eggs in the fall, but they wouldn't lay their eggs till the spring?
It depends, yeah. So there's kind of multiple options. So some may mate in the spring, and then they'll emerge in the spring, and then that female will find the nest, they'll lay those eggs, and then those eggs that hatch, they might have a generation in that summer, they might have multiple, or it might just be that they'll hatch and then they'll have to find a spot to overwinter as well. So it does also depend on the bee in terms of which stage they overwinter. Yes?
I have a couple of comments in the Zoom chat.
Mm-hmm.
One was saying, please repeat the questions for the benefit.
Oh, repeat the questions, yes. Mm-hmm.
You need to speak louder for us to hear you.
Okay. And John Martin asked, are there any acoustic studies of bees?
Ooh, acoustic studies of bees. So I guess I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that. Probably in some sense in terms of, seeing, they obviously buzz. So to make, probably following the sounds of that. But yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure I understand the question, but probably there's lots of research on lots of different things, so I would imagine acoustics are involved in that. But if maybe they mean how they sense, then I'm sure there is definitely research trying to figure out how they sense different things.
Or do they use sound for communication?
Right, yeah, and which I actually don't know, I think it's mostly kind of pheromones and that kind of thing, but yeah, maybe someone does know that. I would be interested to find out. Wonderful. Okay, great. So here we are with our ground nesters, kind of going into the different, so we just talked about the different kinds of lifestyles of social versus solitary, but there's also the physical locations of where they're nesting. And so about 70% of our bees do nest in the ground. And so this is kind of an example of what this might look like, where there is this female at the entrance of the nest, and she's dug this out in different nest cells down here with individual little pockets of that provision, so that nectar and pollen bundle, and then those eggs that hatch into larvae, need them all there. So there's there's two different kinds. There are, well, there are a couple different kinds. There's solitary ground nesters, which, there's just one little nest, the female provisions it. But there are also gregarious ground nesters, and this is where they form aggregations. So this is common in our sweat bees in particular, where there might just be a really suitable location, and so they'll build their nests just in very close proximity to each other, but it's still pretty much the female provisioning just for her own nest, not really sharing the duties in that sense, but just kind of physically close to each other. There are also communal nesters, and that might be where they have a shared nest entrance, kind of condo style, but then they have individual cells that the individual females will also provision for, and so it's still not a social component, just kind of a communal component. They're building community with each other. And so, like I said earlier, if they're nesting in the ground, they might need to be able to waterproof their cells or their nests to prevent that leaching in, and so they have that strategy as well in different ways. And then we also have our stem and cavity nesters, and so here's an example, kind of that serial component of the back of the nest being the females and the front being the males is kind of an example of those tubes. And so some common plants that the stem and cavity, well, the stem nesters like to nest in are our kind of rose bushes and rose family plants. Also our caneberries, so like our raspberries, salmon berries, blackberries, any of those canes that have those kind of really woody structures with the pithy, soft interior stems. Elderberry is another one that is really common, and so that's a great plant to plant in your garden as well if you want to see. And so very cool, and they'll align their nests with, like I said, little bits of mud or little bits of leaf, petals, little animal hair sometimes even too, and so some good options there. And then cavities, I mentioned rodent nests, abandoned rodent nests are a favorite, especially for some bumblebees, but also maybe in just a little hole in your flower pot, or I had a yard where I could see a little leafcutter in action, and she was going into the little crevice of where there was some kind of decaying wood in the corner of my yard, and so I saw her going into that little tiny cavity there, and so lots of different ways that they like to nest. But don't worry about all the text on this slide, but just kind of a nice landscape shot here in terms of if we're wondering how do we want to support bees in our own yards or green spaces or community gardens. One big one for most organisms in general is planting native plants, of course. So that's going to be the big one for any conservation kind of realm in this sense for gardening. And so planting native plants that especially have a variety of when they bloom, so some early plants, so like Oregon grape and red flowering currant are some early flowers that are really important for those early species, but then also ones that bloom throughout the summer and into fall, and also plants with different shapes and sizes of flowers so that those different bees with those different tongue lengths can access the nectar. And so also reducing the use of pesticides, of course, and leaving the leaves, that's another one. So here's some more winter-focused gardening tips. Leaving the leaves is a classic phrase now, hopefully at this point for a lot of folks. Many, especially bumblebees, like to nest in leaf piles, overwinter in leaf piles. And so they need maybe some soft soil for that too. So avoiding overly compacting your soil, or if you till your garden, maybe leaving some untilled where you have a larger scale, but also leaving some hollowed stems of some dead plants, especially those ones that I talked about earlier, like elderberry and those canes. Sometimes you can even see if there is a little nest in there, because they often will cap the little nest. So you might look into a hollow stem, it might have a little bit of mud at the top, and that's probably an idea that there's a bee living there. So maybe, if you need to cut them back, maybe cutting them about, 10, 20 centimeters down if you can, and then maybe sticking them somewhere else in your yard for them to do their thing. So lots of different options here. Another little thing with lots of text that you don't need to worry about, but this is another resource that we have on our website as well. I also have a little sheet at the front for just some common good plants. We also have one for the southern interior here, anyone visiting the Okanagan or etc. And just last of all, thank you so very much. And here's a cool little photo of a mining bee here for your viewing pleasure for the last little bit as we're reaching the end. So thank you so much. And I see we have a question as well.
I have three questions.
Yes.
One, is there a purpose to these stripes, the black and red stripes on on the abdomen of many, many of the bees and wasps? Number two, how do hornets fit in? And number three, speaking of hornets, there's this northern giant hornet that is, scaring everybody and tends to raid the honeybees' hives. So what's the story there?
Wonderful. Okay, we'll go in order, sequential. So the coloration.
So repeat the question, because the people.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll repeat the question. Wonderful. First question was, what's the deal with that black and yellow striping that so many bees and wasps and things have? The answer is that is a common strategy in nature to appear threatening. So just like how poison dart frogs can have really bright colorations, when you have those highly contrasting colors, it's usually a way of nature saying, watch out, I'm either poisonous or I'm going to sting you or some other really unpleasant way. So this is a signal to not eat me, please. And like I said earlier, flies evolutionarily know this. Quote unquote, they're not making that active decision, but evolutionarily it's worked out for many flies that if they happen to look like bees or wasps with that coloration, they might not get eaten. And so yeah, it's a way to kind of deter predation. The second question was about hornets, where they fit in. So hornets are they're kind of wasp basically, and so they have. I'm afraid I don't know, what makes it a hornet versus other kinds of wasps. They're different kinds of wasps. So some are like mud dauber wasps, where they'll create their nests out of mud. I think hornets might mostly use kind of papery wood materials to create their nests, but don't quote me on that. But they're a large species of somewhat more aggressive wasp, I would say. And then the other question was about that large hornet. I've heard at least a couple years ago there was talk of the murder hornet, and I think that might be what you're referring to, which targets honeybee hives, as we've learned. So yes, this is not native to this continent, and so I will say, to my understanding, I think there was a little bit more of a media frenzy than actual risk at that, especially a couple years ago in our region. I do think they found, at least one or two examples maybe in the state of Washington at that time. But my understanding is that it's not so much of a problem right now. Any species that arrives somewhere that it wasn't originally from can pose a risk of becoming invasive, but not any organism that is non-native is inherently invasive. So I think it would probably need to reach the levels of concern where it would be officially declared, invasive at that point. But definitely we would not want them to establish and to then be able to wreak a lot of havoc on our native species as well, of course, too. So I think it's a little bit, not so much to worry about as we might think, hopefully. Yeah, wonderful. Yes.
I have a couple of the comments in the chat. BJ Allen recommends Ed Young's book called An Immense World about animal senses. So he says there's a section on bees and about senses.
What was the book name again?
An Immense World?
Immense, as in very big. Yeah, so that's a book from 2023. John Martin asked, are there any local citizen science projects focused on bees that anyone can engage with?
Absolutely, great question. Yeah, wondering about the citizen science. So that's actually, there are a couple different options. I'll start out by saying that iNaturalist is a classic case of citizen science. That's an app and also database where anybody can upload a photo of an organism, whether it's a bee or a plant or anything else, and then people can collectively identify that picture, and then you can kind of create a database funded or created by people, any people. But there's also some specific ones to bees. So for instance, there is bumblebeewatch.org, I believe, bumblebeewatch.org it should be. And so that's one where you can upload pictures of bumblebees and either, if you know what species it is, that's great, but I think they also can have people to come through and try to identify the species as well. Another project is that there's actually something that we're doing at the Native Bee Society called the BC Bee Atlas. So this is a project to try to quantify and just classify all of the bees in our province, because believe it or not, there's not really one database for that. So, you might be familiar with the BC eFlora database, for instance, that has all the plants in our province. We're working on that for the bees in our province. And so that's something that we're continuing to work on and apply for grant funding for. And so yeah, happy to, there's more information on our website as well as we're kind of getting things going here. I also just have a little, here's a little slide of resources actually, if you're curious. There's the, oh yes, this is the other one, the BCB tracker on iNaturalist. This is a specific project on iNaturalist where you can join it and then upload your bee photos and people can help identify them that way. Yeah, lots of different good resources here. Our website's up at our website and emails up at the top. There are a couple books recommended down here as well. And so here are some resources. I can also maybe, I don't know, share this with whoever to circulate after or something, or there's also the recording online. Another little plug, is that we do have an event coming up actually, Mini Bee School in Vancouver on November 3rd. And so if you're looking to kind of dive into this world and get some hands-on experience, maybe with using some microscopes to identify bees, this is a great way to do so. So there's also information on our website, and Bonnie Zand will be teaching, and she is just a plethora of knowledge. She lives on Vancouver Island, but she'll be coming over. She's also a board member of the Bee Society, so that's a little plug as well if you're keen. And so that's like another great way to kind of learn more about bees. Yeah. Any other questions?
Do some birds prey on bees?
Yes, they do. Birds sometimes do prey on bees. So I work, when I'm not volunteering with the Bee Society, I work at the Stanley Park Ecology Society, and one of our staff there is a wonderful bird photographer, and he actually sent me a couple photos just the other day saying, can you tell what this bird is eating? I think it was a swift or a swallow in the air eating some insects that were flying. And one of the photos, I was like, I actually think I can tell which species of bumblebee it might be eating just from this photo. So the answer is yes, birds do. Even though they do have those stingers, some birds can handle it. So might not bother them so much. Others, they would avoid it.
BJ Allen says, I remember finding what I believe were furrow bees. They all seem to have individual nests, but they were all clustered in a patch.
Yeah, definitely. So that's probably true. So yeah, furrow bees, let's see if I can, sorry, I'll just go back through all these slides here. It might be a little bit flashing for a moment. Yes, furrow bees, right here. So furrow bees are members of the Halictidae family. And so they are Halictidae is one of the families that has the most instances of that gregarious nesting behavior where they have those aggregations of nests. So it's quite common that you did see a nice little furrow bee with lots of little mounds in your soil. And it might look like just little teeny holes with little loose soil bits around, kind of like a very tiny little ant mound almost. Kind of looks like that. Oh yeah, and Teresa also had a question over here too.
Yeah, I have a question about plants as food sources. I think recognizing that native plants are really important for native species. I've also heard a lot of people making blanket statements like that. Non-native plants are useless to pollinators, or that they're harmful and they're kind of like feeding ducks white bread, that the pollen and the nectar from these other plants is somehow harmful to the native bees. Now I've seen lots of bumblebees and things. I have snow crocus that bloom in January, February. I see bumblebees on them, not just honeybees, and lots of other plants and gardeners I think do see lots of different bees. So I'm just curious, like, is there really any evidence that non-native plants are harmful to native bees?
Good question. And yes, if people on Zoom could not hear, are wondering about if obviously native plants are really important for our bees and other organisms. Are non-native plants not beneficial or even harmful to native bees? Question is a good old it depends in terms of there is truth that some plants have higher protein content in their pollen, for instance, and they might have specific kind of chemical breakdowns that might make nectar or other floral resources more beneficial and more, I guess, nutrient dense for those bees who have evolved alongside it over millions and millions of years. But there are also plants that are great to have because they can provide some blooming, or they bloom at different periods, so they can provide those resources, maybe like you said, early in the season. If those, for instance, those queen bumblebees, if they emerge early and there aren't as many native plants that are blooming, but maybe there are some non-native plants that are around providing some nectar, that can be helpful. But yeah, it kind of depends in terms of them being, if there are any non-native plants that are really, really harmful. I mean, yeah, I think there's probably, so for instance, there might be some that maybe have some nectar that's not very good for them, like they might just kind of empty calories maybe, but in terms of not being as nutritionally dense and kind of like junk food for them, there's kind of some pollen that's also not as nutritionally viable, but I would have to probably dig more into the specific examples, but yeah, a good old
But
kind
there
of,
might
it
be a
depends.
few examples, but it's not a significant.
Yeah, but it's, you know, and you, yeah, it's not as big of an issue. It's more just, you know, if you have like only non-native plants, you obviously don't have room for native plants, and so kind of having a balance is always going to be ideal, of course. That's kind of the general science answer of it depends, and a balance is important. But that would be probably my answer for that.
I have one more question in the chat about parasitisms. Parasitisms.
Yes.
How common is parasitisms of bees?
Yeah, so in terms of kleptoparasitism specifically, for instance, it's about 10% of our bees. I mentioned earlier that the Apidae family, which includes honeybees and bumblebees, but also a few others, has the higher proportion of kleptoparasitism. So again, yeah, kind of 10% overall, but in terms of other kinds of parasitism, so bees don't really engage in just kind of standard, they don't really engage in other types of parasitism to my knowledge other than that specific nest parasitism. So that's kind of my understanding of how they you know, have those relations. Wasps, on the other hand, are a different story. Lots of parasitic and parasitoid wasps, whether they either kill their host or just suck the nutrients from the host, so to speak. So yeah, if that answers the question.
Well, the question was about bees being victims of parasitism.
Oh, I see. Okay, wonderful. Yes. So in that case, yes, that is also very much a thing, being victims of parasitism. So actually, for example, one thing that I said earlier that if you want to kind of get more hands-on involvement in bees, you can maybe look into raising orchard bees, mason bees. But I'll say that a caveat is that you should definitely be prepared to commit to the upkeep and maintenance of those nests, because if you, for instance, if you care for mason bees, you'll put out a little maybe mason bee little house with little tubes, for instance, for them to nest in. You want to be able to clean them and collect those tubes once they have been filled by bees and bring them inside, or, you know, dry, cool, maybe in your garage, some space like that, because they can be hot spots for parasitism and other pathogens as well. If they're just this, you know, nice cluster of freshly laid eggs or maybe larvae, a wasp or other, you know, other insects who parasitize can just swoop on in there and have a buffet. So it's definitely a problem for some bees more than others, but especially you know, with that kind of human-involved component. You don't want to just create a buffet for parasites as well as mites and other pathogens too that are harmful. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Teresa has another question. Yes.
If you want to see some of the interesting, different kind of bees you've told us about, like the sweat bees, minor bees, and that, particular locations or time of year that you would recommend if you want to kind of see some different bees, or?
Yeah, so we're wondering on Zoom when or where you should go to see some of like the cooler, smaller, fun bees that aren't as easy to spot like our bumblebees. I would say one off the bat is just a specific plant that I, for my own experience, just happened to see a lot of those metallic green sweat bees in, and those are dandelions. So if you look, which, you know, yeah, not necessarily native, but hey, and so if you look in the small little dandelion flowers, you might see a teeny little insect that maybe looks like a fly, but it's a bee probably, and kind of scooting around, collecting the pollen. And so just from my own experience, I just happened to notice that that is pretty successful for me. But just in general, any just large patch of lots of diverse flowers, especially native plants, maybe anywhere from May to July, especially is probably peak season for a lot of our bees. And so if you want to see maybe like the orchard bees, the blue orchard mason bees, they're more active in April and May. They're blue orchard mason bee, they are used in agriculture for orchards, so things like cherry trees and apples and plums and all of those rosaceous trees. And so that's another one. If you have any fruit trees nearby around their bloom time, you can take a look and see if there are any fun bees. But yeah, just any native plants especially, and any flowers, you can find a garden and just take a close look. And you might see little bees that they might not all be super colorful, but there might be some pretty tiny ones that are pretty fun to see too.
So they're generally like quite a bit smaller than a honeybee, where the bumblebees tend to be.
Yeah. So size-wise compared to a honeybee, they're generally a bit smaller. Some of them can be close to a honeybee size. They might actually look pretty similar. So for instance, our furrow bees and our mining bees can see this one looks somewhat similar to a honeybee, and especially this one too, right? Kind of looks honeybee-like, so similar size as well. But then there are others that, like our sweat bees, this is obviously not to scale, but this one would probably be about, the length of one of my fingernails or something like that. So, and pretty skinny too. So lots of different shapes and sizes to take a close look at.
John Martin mentions that Nature Vancouver will be supporting the bee school.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, I do believe, I think either as, promoting it or maybe just attending, but that's great, supporting the bee school. And then, you had a question back here.
Yeah, so we just talked about a little bit for the nest-stealing bees.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any defenses the host bee would deploy to combat against these?
Yeah, so let's see, I think they were down. Yes, here. So I mentioned that some of the actual nest parasites might have some, defenses like the sharp-tailed bee, but their hosts that they're targeting might also. So for instance, Megachile down here, this is a genus of leafcutter bees, and we learned earlier that the leafcutter bees have these large mandibles often, so sometimes they might be able to use that for self-defense, even if they're, mostly for plant materials, but they might be able to use, or, could try to use their stinger, but yeah, kind of depends on the size matchup as well, in terms of whether the bee that is targeting the host is able to kind of take it on, or if it's too big of a host and it'll just back off. So, but there might be some other defenses, but that's off the top of my head as well.
So it's mainly very active instead of like the bird scene where they have like patterns on the eggs, or like they would kick off the eggs of the other birds, the parasitic birds. So there isn't that kind of like sophisticated defenses, and it's all just trial by combat.
Yeah, okay, so we're comparing it to like cuckoo birds, where they have like the different kind of egg coloration, and they hatch earlier and they kind of push off their other eggs in that nest. And so, I guess like another kind of strategy is that the kleptoparasite will just wait at the entrance of a nest and just try to kind of sneak in while the female is gone and provisioning and collecting pollen and nectar, so that they hopefully don't have to meet face to face. But if they do, they might have some defenses to kind of go head to head in that way. But also a lot of it is just being sneaky about it too.
So the host bee wouldn't like come back to the nest and see like their like differences to their eggs and dispose of them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. To my knowledge, we're wondering if the host bee would come back to their nest and realize that they've been parasitized. I don't know offhand. I would guess that they probably, it's not as obvious in terms of like, for the bird example, they might have vastly different sizes and colors of eggs, so they can kind of clearly tell that's not my egg. But to my understanding, bee eggs aren't as differentiated, and they might not notice. I don't know. Yeah, I actually don't know offhand if there are some bees that are more attuned to that. But I imagine at this point it's also kind of an evolutionary arms race, as it always kind of tends to be, of outwitting the other one over many, many years to be sneakier or to be more asserting. So that's kind of where I would say. I would like to dive into that topic more and see if there are other more specific examples, but if that helps. Yes.
We know that if a female bee stings us, it dies because the stinger kind of pulls out your damages the bee. Is that true if a bee is using its stinger, like if it was using it against like another bee or something? Would it die also, in which case it wouldn't be a very good defense strategy?
So yeah, we're wondering, so with bees and how they sting you, their stinger might come out and they might die. That's mostly actually just true for honeybees, because honeybees, and this is actually kind of a kind of, commonly asked question about stinging and native bees. So most native bees, actually, I would actually venture to say that all of them, and it might just be the European honeybee that has their stinger connected to their internal organs, and so that's why when honeybees sting you and the stinger comes out, it pulls all of their organs with it and they die. Very gross. But they also have more of a hive mentality because they are social insects, social bees, so the honeybees might be more predisposed to stinging because they have that drive to defend the nest at whatever cost to their own individual selves. Whereas our native bees, they're probably going to be less inclined to sting because they are solitary. They don't really have that drive to protect in the same way that those social honeybees do. And they also typically can sting multiple times. Like bumblebees, for instance, can definitely sting multiple times unless they happen to get crushed or something, but they can still do that, and so it's an okay defense mechanism, so that they don't have to have it a one shot and then they die. So yeah, usually they can sting multiple times.
Have you been stung by native bees when you're doing your research? How often have you been stung?
Great question. So to my knowledge, I'm pretty sure I haven't ever seen myself get stung by a native bee. I was even, netting bumblebees, reaching inside the net to transfer them into little vials. Never got stung. However, I will say that I was actually giving a native bee walk for my job at Stanley Park, and at the end of it, I was in a garden space and I leaned up against a little bed and I got stung by something, but I didn't see it. And I don't know what it is, but I think it might have been a bumblebee though. To my knowledge, that might have been the first confirmed case for me that I've been stung by a native bee, and I think it was a bumblebee. But again, I didn't see it, so I actually don't know. But other than that, I have not gotten stung. So kind of depends on what you're working with.
Yes, I noticed somebody in the garden, and I was wondering, what are they doing? Went out, and she was a neighbor was walking by, and she picked up a bee, I don't know what kind, a small one, on a sidewalk, and then she was saying that she's from Mexico. She said, there, if you hold it in your hands and warm it, it can help it to, I don't know, recover. And so we actually went through a big process that got it a little insectarium, put plants. It didn't survive. I think it jumped out or it fell again anyway. But is that accurate, that idea that if you pick them up and if they look stunned and you warm them in your hands, that they can?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we're wondering if we had a friend who was picking up some bees and warming them in their hands to try to help them, send them on their way. So my guess would be that it was probably a little bit cold outside, just in general, or it might be the end of the season for those bees, the end of their lifespan. So most native bees only live for 2 to 4 or 6 weeks, depending on depending on if they're males or females or what species, but our native bees, especially our bumblebees, are much more resilient in terms of flying in colder temperatures and windier conditions. So they might be out more, but they also might get, overestimate their own abilities in a sense and maybe get caught in a colder patch, or they might, slow down. They might not have had enough nectar in that time frame, and so they might have to land, and that might be where you encounter them, and they might be a little bit cold. And so in that case, warming them up and kind of giving them that boost can help. But if they're on the ground because they are either sick, maybe from pesticides or something, or maybe more likely just it's the end of their lifespan in general, then wouldn't really do much for them at that point, obviously. Obviously sometimes people will offer a little, pick a flower or offer some sugar water if they are exhausted in some way. And if they are needing that boost, and that can help them too, but it kind of depends on what their reason is, I guess, for being stranded on the ground. Yeah, but great question. Fun to warm up the little bees, save them. Wonderful. Well, yeah. Any other Any other questions here too?
Yeah, Dad has petunia, and I noticed they're really sticky. So is that for the bee to drink up, the sweet stickiness of the?
Yeah, so I guess, I don't know for petunias in particular, but different plants have different kinds of, substances. So it might be either floral oils, it might also be like a latex kind of material. And so some bees may definitely collect that resource. If it's, depending on what it actually is, they might either eat it if it's, nectar-like, or maybe they'll collect it and use it to either line their nests or to bundle into some pollen for their young as well. But for petunias in particular, I don't know if I've worked with them enough to kind of know exactly what that substance might be, but a couple different options there. So, but probably something utilizes that substance at some point.
As the MC, I just wanted to thank everybody who's here in person and everybody who joined us in Zoom for thank our speaker for a very interesting and informative talk on not just how many different bees there are, but the different behaviors and everything is certainly really very interesting. And I also want to urge everybody who's here in person to stay for a couple more minutes, because we actually have a door prize tonight, which is that we've got some tickets for a couple of films in the film festival that